Hi, my name is Mario. I'm one of the creators of Libgdx. Libgdx is a HTML5, Android, desktop, iOS game development framework where you write your code in Java and you only do that once and deploy to all of those targets. What I'm going to talk about in this video is how to set up a Libgdx project and how to run and debug it on the various platforms. Before we do that, I want to quickly give you an overview of where to find information. The main site is at libgdx.bedlogicgames.com. Here you have a nice menu that should be pretty self-explanatory. Under news, you get the latest news from the blog and from my Twitter account. Follow me. Features is not an extensive or comprehensive list of all the features that we actually support. Download and source tells you where to get release builds. Those are considered stable, and nightly builds, which are built every night by our build server, which are pretty stable as well. I usually would go with those just to get the cutting edge features and all the bug fixes. And it also tells you where to get the source code. If you find a bug, that means if you have a piece of code that we can compile and reproduce the issue with, post it on the issue tracker. Before you do that, maybe post on the forums, which are here. It's likely that it's not a bug in Libgdx, but more issue with how you use things. Okay, we also have documentation, which is found here. Java docs, we have a wiki, we have a lot of external tutorials. In the GitHub repository, there's also demo games and tests from which you can learn. This page will tell you how to check those things out and look through them. Okay, so now let's create a new Libgdx project and see how we can debug and run it on all the platforms. Before we do anything, we actually need to make sure that we have all the necessary tools installed. So for that, go to documentation and the wiki. And there's a prerequisites article, which tells you exactly what you need. You will need the JDK for Java development. You will need Eclipse. We are heavily Eclipse-based just because Android and GWT integrate pretty well with Eclipse. You need the Android SDK and the Eclipse ADT plugin. And if you want to deploy to HTML5 WebGL, you need the Google Web Toolkit. That is true for all the platforms you develop on. Say if you want to develop on Windows, Linux, or Mac, you get that, install it, that should be it. Now, if you want to deploy to iOS, you will need additional things. First of all, you need a Mac to deploy to iOS. There's just no way to deploy to an iOS device or simulator from Windows or Linux. You need the latest Xcode that you can get in the macOS App Store. And you need a monotouch license. There's an evaluation license that's fully functional and lets you test things on a simulator. That's free. If you want to deploy to an iOS device for testing or to the App Store, you will either need a student license, which is $79, or a full license, which is $399. I would suggest that before you buy any of those licenses, just get the evaluation license and try out your thing on this simulator. You will also need AND, which you can download and just extract it and make sure that it's available from everywhere. The easiest way to achieve that is just to create a symlink from your AND bin directory and the AND file in there to user bin AND on macOS X. Finally, make sure that Java C and AND can actually be executed on command line. That would look something like this. Let me open it. Okay, so Java C should output something like this. This is a very, very punny little Mac, so we will have a little bit of a performance problem while we go through all of this. And this is AND. So just make sure that those are actually available to all applications, and the iOS stuff should just work. Okay. So once you have all of that set up and there's links to how to set up things, we can actually create our first Libgdx application. And for that, we can either use the latest release or a nightly build. I would suggest to go with a nightly build because they include bug fixes and new features. So I go there. This might be a little confusing. You have a zip file which contains all the libraries Libgdx consists of. You can download either that or you can do something else. You can go to the dist directory here and just download the GDX setup UI. That is a Swing application that lets you create a project skeleton for Eclipse pretty easily. So just download that file and open it. And you will see something like this. Now you can click on create. You can specify a couple of things here, like the name of your project, the package you want all your classes to be stored in, the name of the main class, and so on and so forth. You can also specify whether you want to create these projects for those backends. We leave that at the default. The only thing we change is we want to output that to an Eclipse workspace. I created an empty one, which is called example workspace. Just choose that directory. That's pretty much it. The next step is to download Libgdx. So we have to tell the setup UI whether to use the latest stable or latest nightly version. We click on the nightly version. That's it. And that will download for a while. Okay, so now the Libgdx nightlies are downloaded. That's indicated by a green label here. And we can click on Open Generation screen and just say Launch. And those folders will be created in the destination folder we specified earlier. So that's pretty much it. We now have that in our example workspace. As you can see here, there's one core project which contains all your actual source code, the Android project which contains the assets which are shared across the other projects, the desktop project, an HTML5 project, and an iOS project. Note that the iOS project is not going to be imported in Eclipse. That has to be opened with MonoDevelop. We'll look at that later. So let's start by first importing all of those projects into Eclipse. Oh my god, it's so slow. Come on. There we go. So to import the projects, you just click in the Package Explorer, right click, say import, go to File and Import. Now go to General, Existing Projects into Workspace, browse to the example workspace folder, and we're already in there, so I select that, and it will detect that there's 4 Eclipse projects in there. Note again that the iOS project is not an Eclipse project, but a MonoDevelop project. So that's all fine. We click Finish, and that will import all the projects eventually, once the Mac decides to actually do some work. Awkward pause. So if you have a Mac Mini to develop for iOS, I warmly recommend you to install a lot more RAM. I'm currently running on 2 gigabytes. That's a little bit too little for doing that kind of development stuff. I hope it hasn't exploded. Okay, so now Eclipse is done with importing the project. As you can see, the HTML project has a little problem. That's due to the GWT SDK jar missing. We can easily fix that. Just go to the Problems pane, right click, and say Quick Fix. And just click Finish. Okay, so everything compiles. Let's quickly go through the structure of this one more time. So we have the MyGDX game project, which is the core project, as we call it. That actually contains all the source code of your game, which is then shared across the different platforms. So in the core project, we have this, an application listener. I will refer to you to a little wiki article which explains all of this to you later on. We're not going to go through that now. This application listener is like the main entry point for your application, and that's going to be reused in all the other platforms. For each platform, we then have a project like MyGDX Game Android, which usually only consists of a single source file, where we create an application and then create a configuration for that application, for that backend, or for that platform, and tell it to use our application listener, in this case, MyGDX Game. That's called a starter class, and there's one per backend or per platform you target. So that one was for Android. Then there's one for the desktop, which looks pretty similar. It's just an LWHHL application instead of an Android application, and it has a different kind of configuration. The same is true for the HTML platform, So then you have a GWT launcher, which is a GWT application. It again creates a configuration and tells us what application listeners you use. So you usually write all your code in the core project and then just start any of those projects to test the game on the respective platform. One minor thing, the actual assets, that is images, music and sound files and so on and so forth, are stored in the Android project. That's just how it has to be, because that's how Android projects work, and they are stored in the assets directory. This assets directory is shared across all the projects, so the desktop project actually references this asset folder. Same is true for the HTML and the iOS project. Okay, so I would say let's start by trying to run the desktop version of the game. Just right click the desktop project, run as Java application. Select the main, and eventually a little window will pop up and show us a logo. So yeah, that's pretty much our game so far. It just loads an image and draws it to the screen. Now we can test it on Android. For that purpose, I started an Android emulator earlier. You should not test on the emulator. I'm just doing it so you have everything on the screen. Please, please, please don't use the emulator. It doesn't represent anything really in terms of OpenGL and so on and so forth. So to start it, just right click, run as Android application. There's this little logcat thing, which is like the console for Android, where you can see what is happening on your Android device or emulator while you run your application. I would highly recommend to look into the Android developer guide to get to know more about how all of these things work. So okay, I just told it to start it on the emulator, and it's doing something weird. I cannot stress how important it is to have enough RAM in your Mac Mini. Okay, and now we have the game running on Android. You would usually have to test on a device, don't use the emulator again. To run it on HTML5, that is in your browser, via pure JavaScript, just right click the HTML project, say run as web application. Now with GWT there's two modes of how you can run your application. One is called development mode, that lets you debug your application. This is done how I just showed you. Just right click run application. Then in the development pane there will be a URL, just double click that and that will be opened in your default browser. You might be asked to install a GWT plugin that is needed to run your application in development mode. So let's look at what our browser is actually doing. There we go. So while this is loading, I can tell you a little bit more about GWT. The development mode is kind of like a debugger. Most of the things are actually run in Java. If you want to deploy it to, say, a website, you will have to compile the application. And that works by just right-clicking, going to Google, and then say GWT compile. What will happen is that all your Java source code and all the assets and so on and so forth will be put into the war directory, and you can just copy the contents of this war directory, put them on your web server, and point your browser at the index.html file, which you can modify. In that case, the application is pure JavaScript, so there's no need for Java applets or anything Java related really. If you want to know more about that, just look up how GWT or the Google Web Toolkit works. So this hasn't loaded yet because this Mac is really slow. Let's see. Okay, so it should have loaded. Let's go to the browser, and there we see a fancy application running. So that's been running the project on the desktop, Android, and the HTML5 backend. What we can of course do as well is debug the application. So just to give it a quick idea, let's go to the main class, which is, oh god, this is so slow. My GDX game. Let's just put a breakpoint here. There we go. Oh, we don't. Come on, breakpoint. Yeah. So on the desktop, just right click. Instead of run as, use debug as in Java application. It's pretty simple. You have to again choose the main class. And the application will start up and break here. Yes, please show me the debug perspective. So yeah, and you can then just use F6 and F5 to step into things. So you also have the variable view here, so that's all pretty standard Eclipse stuff. What's more interesting is that if you remove that breakpoint, you can actually change the code on the fly. You cannot add new methods or fields, but you can change method bodies while the application is running. Just change it, then save the file, and that will be reloaded. So as you can see, I just changed the background color. Can do that again. And the application is not restarted, it's just that the method contents will be exchanged for the new ones. So that's pretty handy if you want to quickly test, say, offsets and so on and so forth. Debugging on the other platforms is exactly the same. So you would just right click, say debug as Android application, and here you would say right click debug as web application. Note that on Android in HTML5 you cannot do the code hot swapping I just showed you for the desktop backend. So that's all you have to do in Eclipse. Now let's look at how to actually start it in iOS. For that I go back to my example workspace folder where the Libgdx game iOS project is, and here I have the .sln file, which is a solution file for MonoDevelop. So provided you have that installed, just open it up. I will close Eclipse in the meantime just to have more processing power. And even closing takes a lot of power apparently. I'll also close the browser just to make sure. Ermagerd. Nate. Once MonoDevelop is open, you can see it's pretty much the same structure as we have for an Eclipse project. We have a main CS file in this case. Monotouch is C#, pretty much. And there we have, again, an application. We have a configuration. We specify which application listener to use, and so on and so forth. So that's pretty standard stuff again. Here's the data folder. If you remember, the assets were in the Android project. This is a link to that Android projects folder. The problem with Monotouch is that it won't automatically include new files. So what you have to do if you add new images and sounds is just right click here and say add existing folder or existing files and so on and so forth. Once they're added, you have to tell Monotouch which build action you want to use, which should be set to content. That way the resource will be included in the final build. There's also references, and you're not too concerned about that. That's the DLL of your game code. What's happening here is that the Java source files of your core project will be compiled to Java bytecode. That bytecode is then translated to .NET bytecode via something called IKVM. And that .NET bytecode is then transformed into ARM7 assembler, which runs on the iPhone or iPad by Monotouch or Mono. We've wrapped all that process for you in in an AND file basically that you usually don't have to touch. So this is pretty easy to use. So I just opened the project in MonoDevelop. I click on, say, start debugging, and what's happening is, as you can see here, it first compiles the Java code via AND. Yeah, I tell you what it is in a minute. Once that's compiled, it pushes it through IKVM, which will make a DLL out of it, which is called mygdxgame.dll, which is referenced here. And as you can see, it's currently missing because Monotouch doesn't notice that the file was actually generated. And once that is complete, Monotouch will just compile the CS file and pull in all the references and resources. It puked a little because it couldn't find the DLL because we just generated it for the first time. So the first time you build it, you have to then reopen the solution. So just go to File, Recent Solutions, and click the first one. And now our Libgdx game DLL is recognized. So we can now say we want to debug on the iPhone simulator, for example, or on the iPhone or iPad, whatever you have connected. For that, you will need an Apple developer license, which costs another $99, which is pretty ridiculous. And you will have to get a certificate. Look that up on the Monotouch documentation site. They explain how to get that certificate and how to configure it and so on and so forth. Okay, so let's just start debugging on the iPhone simulator. Just hit the Start Debugging button. So compilation takes a little while because it's compiled to native code. You may wonder, how do you debug the Java code in Monotouch since it's C# or whatever .NET language you have? Well, we can do the following. We can go to Open File. Oh god, why are you so slow? Come on. And I can just go to my core project. So if I go back to example workspace, I go to my core project where my source files for my games are, go to source, and navigate to the Java files I want to debug. So in this case we only have my Libgdx game, so I open that. And that pulls in the Java file. Okay, this is the iOS simulator. And we're waiting for a connection. While we do that, we can try to set a breakpoint. So this is the Java file, same as we had in Eclipse. And this is our application, running just fine. And now let's put a breakpoint here. And there we go. So now we can step here as well. It's pretty simple. You have the local variable view, where you can check fields and so on and so forth. So all of that works pretty much as in Eclipse. You cannot do code hot swapping, of course, but it's sufficient for normal debugging, which is pretty great. Okay, one last thing. If you modify the Java source code, Monotouch will not know that. So if you do that, you have to do a clean build or just call rebuild all to make sure that everything's fine. Every time you compile, you have to basically see the output of and IKVM. That's it. Okay, so that should be it for now. If you have any more questions, go on the forums or our IRC channel on Freenode, Libgdx. Happy coding.